An old man tied 3 helpless German Shepherd puppies to a weathered oak tree on the outskirts of Austin, Texas, under the blistering summer sun, and then a soldier did something unimaginable. The puppies, barely able to stand, had been left to die in the suffocating heat. No food, no water, no hope. Cars and trucks rumbled down the dusty back road. Some drivers slowed, glanced, shook their heads, and kept going. Nobody stopped. Until a U.S. Army sergeant, just back from deployment and carrying invisible scars, spotted them. What he did next would change everything. This story will restore your faith in second chances, in loyalty, and in the unspoken bond between a warrior and the silent souls he chose to save. Son, the heat was merciless, the kind that cracks the dirt and silences even the cicadas. For the 3 tiny pups, tied to a tree swarmed with mosquitoes in an abandoned lot, there was no shade, no shelter. They were only 6 weeks old, paws too big for their fragile legs, ears still floppy and unsure. The oldest, dark-coated with curious eyes, let out a faint whimper. His sandy-colored brother answered with a weak cry. The smallest, with a white patch on his chest, trembled in fear. The rough rope cut into their necks as they struggled, hungry, confused, desperate for the mother who had vanished hours before. Old woman from a nearby window, Mrs. Thompson, an elderly neighbor, peeked through her lace curtain. She had seen the man pull up in a rusted-out pickup, climb down slowly, and tie the puppies with a frayed rope. He wiped the sweat from his brow, looked around, and drove off without a word. Mrs. Thompson had even called animal control, but no one came. Deep down, she doubted anyone would. Not out here, not for 3 unwanted dogs. But someone was on his way. Sergeant Michael Harris had been home for only 12 days. After 8 long years in the Army and 2 tours overseas, he had returned to his late father's ranch outside Austin to settle the estate and maybe figure out what life looked like without war. The streets of his hometown whispered memories of childhood, but now everything felt different, quieter, emptier, as if the part of him that belonged there had been replaced by something harder, scarred. That afternoon, Michael walked alone down a dirt road, boots kicking up dust, trying to shake the pressure building in his chest. The silence, once comforting, now pressed against his ears like a weight. Then he heard it, a faint, broken cry, then another. At first he thought it was a memory echoing back at him. But the sound came again, sharp and real. He followed it, slipping through a broken fence, until he saw them. 3 puppies tied up, panting, barely moving. Michael's heart stopped. He dropped to his knees. The smell hit him first. Sweat, dirt, and something worse. Dehydration and fear. The brown pup was curled up, eyes half shut, nearly unconscious. The smallest shrank from his shadow, while the dark-coated one tried to rise, letting out a weak growl. "Easy. I'm not going to hurt you," Michael whispered, pulling a small pocket knife from his jeans. Carefully, he cut the ropes. One by one, the puppies collapsed into his arms. Too light, too fragile, heartbreakingly silent. He unscrewed his canteen and let a few drops of water spill into his palm. They drank like they hadn't tasted water in days. Anger boiled inside him, mixed with something deeper, the duty he thought he'd buried with his uniform. "You're coming with me. I've seen too much to walk away." As he carried them back to his truck, the smallest lifted his head and rested his chin on Michael's wrist. Michael didn't know it yet, but that simple gesture wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of healing, for them and for him. He brought them to his father's old garage, still smelling of motor oil, sawdust, and forgotten memories. He cleared a corner, laid down 2 worn sleeping bags, and gently set the puppies inside. The smallest, with the white patch, whimpered at every movement. Michael opened a can of wet dog food he'd picked up at the local feed store and said softly, "I don't even know your names yet." He dipped his fingers into the food and held it to the pup's mouth. At first, the little one flinched, but then his tongue brushed Michael's hand, and his tiny jaw worked clumsily to chew. The others followed. The brown one devoured hungrily, while the dark-coated pup never broke eye contact with Michael, as if trying to read him. Leaning back against the wall, Michael let out a long breath. He hadn't felt at ease since his father's funeral, but watching the 3 pups curled up on the blanket, bellies rising and falling slowly, he saw something fragile and true. Crescent moon. Later that night, the smallest began to cry, a broken sob that echoed through the garage and pierced Michael's chest. He shot up, instincts kicking in like the old days on night patrol. He scooped the pup into his arms, wrapped him in his hoodie, and held him close. "It's okay. You're safe now, I promise." Little by little, the crying stopped, and for the first time in months, Michael's thoughts began to quiet. The next morning, he woke stiff, still sitting against the wall, the white-patched pup asleep in his arm, the other two curled at his feet. Blinking against the sunlight streaming through the broken windows, Michael realized he hadn't planned on keeping them forever. His idea had been to nurse them back to health, then hand them off to a rescue group or maybe someone trained to handle police dogs. But these weren't ordinary dogs. Even weak, their strong bloodline showed. They were German Shepherds bred for police or military work. High-value animals someone had invested in, only to discard. Michael couldn't understand why. Later that hot Texas afternoon, he carried them into the house that had stood empty since his father's death. Dust-covered furniture, coffee mugs abandoned on the counter, stacks of unopened mail. The house had never felt like a home since his mother passed, and his father had grown cold and distant. But as the puppies stumbled across the living room, sniffing table legs, yipping softly at their reflections in the fireplace glass, something began to change. They brought warmth, sound, and life back into the silence. Michael found himself laughing out loud when the brown pup tumbled headfirst into a laundry basket, while the dark-coated one barked in protest before wagging his tail, eyes shining with energy. "Focus and loyalty," Michael said, scratching the pup's head. "You're a little troublemaker, but you've got spirit." And in that moment, he realized something inside him was filling again. Not only were the puppies beginning to heal, he was too. "Focus and loyalty," Michael said, scratching the pup's head. "You're a little clumsy, but you've got grit." In that moment, he felt something inside him begin to fill. Not only were the puppies starting to heal, he was finding a new path for himself. 3 days passed since Michael had brought them into his late father's old house, and the change was visible in all of them. The smallest, now named Star for the crescent-shaped patch on her chest, finally ate without hesitation. The brown one, christened Rusty, followed him everywhere. Awkward, but loyal. And the dark-coated pup, whom he called Blaze, was bold, alert, and incredibly intelligent. Blaze watched Michael the way a soldier watches his commander, with patience and silent expectation. That morning, Michael sat on the porch with a mug of strong black coffee, while the pups explored the yard. He even started building a small shelter out of scrap wood from the barn, something to keep them warm on cold Texas nights. He caught himself humming an old country tune, something he hadn't done since before the war. Then a car slowed on the dirt road. Michael stiffened, instincts flaring. A black sedan rolled to a stop at the gate, its engine idling low before the tinted window slid down. A man in his 60s, sharp eyes under a pulled-down Stetson, called out, "You Michael Harris?" Still holding his coffee, Michael listened as the man introduced himself as Mr. Anderson. "I hear you've got 3 German Shepherds of high value, bred for police work." "And why would I have them?" Michael replied slowly. Mr. Anderson explained, "I was supposed to pick them up 4 days ago from a breeder named Conrad Nash. But when I arrived, they told me someone else had taken them. A friend said they'd gone to a better home." Michael's jaw tightened. Conrad Nash was a name he'd seen on shipping invoices addressed to his father, though he'd never paid much attention. Mr. Anderson glanced toward the yard, and at that moment Blaze appeared in the doorway, ears pricked. "They've got potential," Anderson muttered. "They've got attitude." "They're just puppies," Michael answered, stepping forward, "rescued from something terrible." The man narrowed his eyes. "You're not a civilian, are you?" Michael stayed silent. "I'm not here to fight," Anderson continued. "But those dogs weren't abandoned by accident. They were hidden. That old man knew exactly what he was doing." With a calm but firm voice, Michael replied, "If someone tied these pups to a tree and left them to die, they're not fit to care for a goldfish, let alone a dog." Anderson raised an eyebrow. "You think that makes them yours?" Michael stepped off the porch. "No, that makes them nobody's, until someone who truly cares steps up, and that someone is me." A long silence followed, until Mr. Anderson gave a faint smile. "You got lucky." Before Michael could respond, Anderson rolled up the window and drove off, kicking up a cloud of dust. Michael stood there, heart pounding. Not from fear, but from the realization that these puppies were more than abandoned. They were valuable, and now someone knew exactly where they were. Crescent moon. That night, Michael sat by the window, his shotgun propped against the door. The pups slept peacefully in their crate, unaware of the danger. But Michael couldn't sleep. His mind churned with questions. Why would someone hide the dogs? Why leave them to die? And why did Blaze, with his intense, almost military gaze, seem to understand more than a pup should? The next morning, Michael found a key in one of his father's locked drawers. Inside were documents, contracts, and breeding certificates. One name repeated over and over: Tactical Canine Training Program, Dallas Division. Beneath a photograph of a German Shepherd identical to Blaze were the words, "Sire, Maximus, killed in action." Michael stared at the paper, and suddenly everything made sense. These weren't ordinary puppies. They were living legacies. By the end of the week, they had already adapted to a routine. They recognized the sound of his boots on the floorboards, knew when it was time to eat, rest, or play. But more than that, a deeper bond was forming. Rusty, the brown pup, was playful and clumsy, always the first to trip over his own paws. Star, sweet and timid, shadowed Michael everywhere, resting her head on his lap whenever he sat quietly. And Blaze, the dark-coated one, was different. He didn't just obey. He absorbed every gesture, every command. Michael hadn't planned on training them, but old habits die hard. He tossed a ball, and Blaze fetched it with laser focus. At the sound of a whistle, Blaze stopped, turned, and sat as if he'd done it 100 times before. Not the behavior of a typical puppy. That morning, Michael decided to test an idea in the backyard, under a vast Texas sky. He set up a makeshift obstacle course with old barrels, crates, and trash cans. Nothing fancy, just to see how the pups would react. Rusty got distracted by a butterfly before the next turn. Star froze, uncertain, but Blaze locked eyes on Michael. "Stay." The pup obeyed instantly. "Come!" And Blaze shot forward, hitting the ground in a blur. Michael's heart raced. He knelt beside him, hand on the pup's back. "You've done this before, haven't you? Or maybe it's just who you are." Blaze stayed still, alert, and in that moment, Michael felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. Later, he reopened the folder. The sire's name was there, Maximus, a war dog, who, according to reports, had saved 3 soldiers during an ambush overseas before being killed. Now his descendant was under Michael's roof. It all made sense. The intelligence, the discipline, the fire in Blaze's eyes. These puppies had been bred for service, and someone had tried to erase them. "Hey!" Michael shouted. The intruder bolted. Michael didn't fire, but Blaze did something no puppy should have been capable of. He tore forward, barking with a deep, commanding tone that echoed like a trained guard dog. He moved faster than his siblings, faster than Michael expected, and planted himself directly in the intruder's path. The man stumbled, crashed to the ground, then scrambled back to his car and sped off down the dirt road. Michael scooped Blaze into his arms, heart pounding. "You just held the line. You weren't afraid. You gave yourself to protect us." Blaze licked his chin and nestled against his chest. In that moment, Michael realized this wasn't just a pet, this was a partner. The next morning, he made a decision. He would never hand the puppies over, not to the program, not to a shelter, and certainly not to the people who wanted them dead. They weren't just puppies anymore. They were his responsibility, and he would not fail them. Crossed swords, Michael had faced real fear in war, but nothing rattled him like the thought of someone breaking into his property to steal dogs. Blaze's fearless defense only strengthened his resolve. These animals weren't abandoned. They were valuable, and they were marked for the wrong reasons. At dawn, he drove into town with Blaze riding shotgun, alert, as if he already knew the world outside was dangerous. Michael parked behind the police station. Sheriff Daniels, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, and an old childhood friend, came out to meet him. "Well, if it isn't Sergeant Harris," the sheriff said, eyeing Blaze. "That's your new recruit." Michael gave a faint smile. "I need a favor." He told him everything. The abandonment, the folder he'd found in his father's desk, the visit from Mr. Anderson, the shadow by the barn. The sheriff listened in silence, then leaned forward. "You're not wrong about the program. It's private, well-funded, and they hate bad publicity. They've had problems before." "What kind of problems?" Michael asked. "Faulty litters, dogs sold off too young, cases of aggression. They cover it all up to avoid lawsuits." "Conrad Nash," Michael muttered. "That name's come up in reports," the sheriff confirmed. "They push those dogs too hard, and they don't like questions." Michael looked down at Blaze, resting calmly by his boot. "He's not dangerous. He's disciplined, intelligent, protective. I've seen soldiers with less loyalty." The sheriff studied the pup. "Doesn't look like a problem to me." "He's not, but they think he is." The sheriff sighed. "I'll dig into Nash. But be careful. These people don't knock twice." Back at the ranch, Michael reinforced the windows, moved the puppies, crate into his bedroom, and kept the shotgun loaded within reach. He didn't just feel the instinct to protect, he felt hunted. That night, while feeding the pups, he opened the folder again. Blaze curled against his leg, tail wagging slowly. Michael traced the family tree with his finger. Maximus, the sire, killed in combat and decorated. Delilah, the dam, still alive in some breeder's kennel tied to the program. And, at the bottom of the page, a handwritten note. Litter 0099A rejected for instability. Destroy by end of week. Michael's breath caught. Rejected. Destroyed. That was the plan. They were never supposed to survive, he whispered. And now someone wanted to finish what the breeder had started. He stood and looked at the three pups. Star slept on her back, paws twitching in a dream. Rusty gnawed the corner of a pillow. And Blaze stared at him, waiting for a signal. "You're not rejects," Michael said softly. "You're fighters." He went to the closet and pulled out a heavy green military duffel he hadn't touched since coming home. Inside were his old training gloves, utility gear, a whistle, and a new purpose. He wouldn't just protect them. He would train them, strengthen them, and make them impossible to erase. If anyone wanted to take them, they'd have to go through him. Sunrise. The next day began like any other. The pups were stronger. Rusty was putting on weight. Star wagged her tail with new confidence. And Blaze, always alert, already responded to Michael's voice as if he'd been born for it. In the backyard, Michael built a makeshift obstacle course. Tunnels from old tires, jumps from scrap lumber, even a scent test with worn gloves and tuna cans. What started as curiosity became routine. Blaze stood out. His posture, his timing, his unwavering focus on every command. It was discipline, the kind once drilled into soldiers. It wasn't just instinct. It was something deeper, as if Blaze had chosen Michael, not the other way around. "Good boy," Michael murmured after a flawless run. Blaze wagged his tail with pride. Inside, Michael reopened the folder. Litter 0099, rejected for instability. But there was no instability, no aggression. Nothing to justify the suffering these pups had endured. So why? Pause suddenly. Star barked. "Sharp! Urgent!" Michael rose and went to the window. A black SUV had stopped on the dirt road. Not fast, not slow, deliberate. He grabbed a shotgun and stepped onto the porch, Blaze right behind him, ears low, body tense. The vehicle idled 20 yards away. The engine rumbled. Then the door opened. It wasn't Mr. Anderson. A younger man in a tailored suit and dark sunglasses stepped out, expressionless. He stood by the car, hands in his pockets, eyes hidden. "Can I help you?" Michael called. The man tilted his head. "Mr. Harris, I believe you have something that doesn't belong to you. I think you're at the wrong place." "I don't think so. You're in possession of 3 German Shepherds bred for law enforcement." Property of the Tactical Canine Program. I'm here to collect them. Collect them? Michael's voice went cold. You mean the dogs tied to a tree and left to die? The man's reply was ice. They were scheduled for removal. Director's orders. You shouldn't have interfered. You nearly killed them. We were correcting a mistake. Michael's grip tightened on the shotgun. Behind him, Blaze growled low. The man gestured toward the SUV. The rear door opened. Another figure stepped out, carrying a black case, the kind used for tranquilizers. The message was clear. They were here to take the pups, by force if necessary. Michael leveled his voice. I'll say this once. Leave my property. The suited man stepped forward slowly. You were a soldier, Harris. You know how this works. Orders are orders. You think you're protecting them, but you're only delaying the inevitable. Michael raised the shotgun. I'm not delaying anything. I'm ending it. The man hesitated, glanced at Blaze, already bristling with loyalty, and muttered, Unbelievable. He signaled his partner. The man with the case advanced. But Blaze shot forward like lightning, planting himself in the intruder's path, barking with a ferocity that shook the night. Star and Rusty joined him, smaller but just as determined, forming a living wall between the threat and their home. The intruder backed away slowly, cast one last look at Michael, and retreated to the SUV. The vehicle reversed, spitting gravel, and disappeared into the dark. Michael dropped to his knees beside Blaze, hands on his muzzle. You chose to protect us. Yes, you did. That night, he locked every door. But for the first time, he didn't feel alone. This wasn't just about saving puppies. It was about facing something bigger. After all this time, Michael Harris had found a cause worth fighting for, and someone who would fight beside him. You are a soldier, Harris. You know how this works. Orders are orders. You may think you're protecting them, but all you're doing is delaying the inevitable. Michael raised the shotgun. I'm not delaying anything. I'm ending this. The man hesitated, glanced at Blaze, who already showed unshakable loyalty, and muttered, Unbelievable! He signaled to his partner. The man with the black case stepped forward, but Blaze shot out like lightning, crossing the yard in seconds, planting himself in the intruder's path, barking with a ferocity that rolled across the Texas hills. Star and Rusty joined him, smaller but just as determined, forming a living wall between the threat and their home. The intruder backed away slowly, cast one last look at Michael, and retreated to the SUV. The vehicle reversed, spitting gravel, and disappeared down the road. Michael dropped to his knees beside Blaze, hands on the pup's muzzle. You chose to protect us. Yes, you did. That night, he locked every door. But for the first time, he didn't feel alone. This wasn't just about saving puppies. It was about facing something bigger. After so long, Michael Harris had found a cause worth fighting for, and someone who would fight beside him. No car returned, no threat came, only silence. But Michael knew it wasn't over. He gathered documents, photos, and evidence, and handed everything to Sheriff Daniels. Weeks later, the Tactical Canine Program was exposed. Conrad Nash was arrested. Justice, at last, was served. Dog Rusty was placed with a young boy on the autism spectrum, becoming his steady companion. Dog Star was adopted by the widow of a retired veteran, who said she hadn't smiled in years until Star came into her life. Dog Blaze never left Michael's side. Together, they trained, healed, and began visiting schools, veterans centers, and local shelters, reminding everyone that even the rejected deserve a second chance. When Michael looked at Blaze now, he didn't just see a dog, he saw redemption. If this story touched your heart, imagine how many more we have to share. Subscribe to Whisker Tales, hit the bell, and join us for every new episode of Courage, Loyalty, and Second Chances. Because every life deserves to be remembered.